The Bourbons, France's most durable dynasty. January 21st, 1793, the Place de la Révolution. In Paris, 10 minutes past 10 in the morning, the blade of the guillotine fell, and the most powerful royal dynasty in the history of the Western world suddenly found itself without a king, without a country, and without any obvious future, because Louis XVI, the man who had just been executed in front of tens of thousands of screaming Parisians, was the direct heir of a family that had ruled France with absolute, unchallenged, often breathtaking authority for nearly 200 years. A family whose name, Bourbon, had once been synonymous with the kind of power that ordinary people could only observe from a very great distance, and with a very great deal of fear. What does it take to bring down a dynasty that powerful? And this is the part of the story that almost nobody expects when they first encounter it. What does it take for that same family to walk back through the front door of the palace less than 25 years later, restored to the throne by the very nations that had spent a generation watching them collapse? The story of the Bourbons begins not in a palace but in a small feudal territory in central France, a region called Bourbon-l'Archambault, where the family first appears in historical records in the 10th century as minor nobility with modest lands, modest titles, and no particular reason to believe that 600 years later one of their descendants would control most of Western Europe through a network of marriages, wars, and carefully engineered political alliances, stretching from Madrid to Vienna to Naples to Warsaw. The family's rise to the French throne came in 1589, when Henry IV, a Protestant king from the Navarre region, converted to Catholicism with the reported observation that Paris was well worth a mass, and Henry's willingness to trade his religion for a crown established a pattern, the Bourbon talent for survival through calculated compromise, that would define the family across the next 4 centuries of European history, and which goes a very long way toward explaining why, even after losing the throne in the most dramatic fashion imaginable, the dynasty kept finding ways to endure. Henry IV turned out to be one of the genuinely competent rulers of the early modern period, a king who ended a full generation of brutal religious civil war in France through the Edict of Nantes in 1598, which granted French Protestants a degree of religious liberty that was, by the standards of 16th century Europe, genuinely remarkable for its restraint and its political intelligence. He stabilized the royal finances, reduced taxation on the peasant population that had been bled nearly dry by decades of conflict, and built the institutional foundations that would allow his successors to concentrate power in the crown to a degree that had never before been seen in France, which is a genuinely important historical observation because it means that Henry constructed the machinery of absolute monarchy with what appear to have been good intentions, believing that a powerful centralized state would protect ordinary French people from the aristocratic predation and religious violence that had devastated the country during his own youth. Louis XIII, Henry's son, governed through the extraordinary Cardinal Richelieu, a man who understood power with a cold, systematic clarity that made him one of the most effective administrators in European history. Richelieu dismantled the independent military fortifications of the Protestant nobility, broke the political power of the great aristocratic houses that had fragmented France for generations, created a network of royal agents called intendants who answered directly to the crown, and exercised the king's authority across every province of the country, and built what historians now recognize as one of the first genuinely modern centralized state apparatuses in the Western world. And the crucial, devastating irony of all of this administrative genius is that Richelieu handed Louis, the Sun King, a machine so powerful and so perfectly engineered for concentrating resources and authority at the center that it could sustain almost unlimited royal ambition, which is precisely what Louis XIV possessed in quantities that would have staggered even the cardinal who made it possible. Louis XIV ruled France for 72 years, longer than any other major monarch in recorded European history. And during those 72 years he constructed at Versailles the most extravagant palace complex the world had ever seen, estimated to have cost the equivalent of several $billion in modern terms. forced the entire French aristocracy to abandon their regional power bases and attend his court as glorified political ornaments, fought 4 major wars that kept France in almost constant military conflict for the better part of 4 decades, and spent money at a rate that would have destroyed the treasury of a smaller country within a decade. Louis called himself the state, l'État, c'est moi, and by the end of his reign in 1715, the debt he had accumulated was so enormous, the tax burden on the ordinary French peasantry so crushing, and the gap between the life lived at Versailles and the life lived in a French village so incomprehensibly vast, that the catastrophe of 1789 was, in a very real sense, already decided, already built into the foundations of the monarchy itself, nearly a full century before it actually arrived. And the most damning verdict one can render on Louis XIV is not that he was wicked, but that he was magnificently, catastrophically indifferent to what his magnificence was costing. Consider the situation this way. Imagine a household that earns a certain income each month but consistently spends 4 times that amount, borrows the difference every single month for 7 decades, and then passes the resulting mountain of debt, along with the unbroken habit of spending 4 times what comes in, to the next generation without explanation, without warning, and without any plan for how the bills are eventually going to be settled. That is essentially what Louis XIV handed France in 1715, and neither Louis XV nor Louis XVI, the 2 kings who followed him, possessed the political courage, the economic understanding, or the genuine commitment to the welfare of ordinary French people that would have been required to address the problem before it reached the point of explosion. Louis XVI was not, by most historical accounts, a stupid man or a cruel one. He was genuinely interested in science, spoke multiple languages, and had a real if largely ineffectual sympathy for the poverty of his people. But he was spectacularly, fatally unsuited to the moment history had handed him, because the moment required a king willing to make enemies of the people who held the most power, willing to force radical fiscal reform on an aristocracy that would resist it with every tool available, willing to stand before the privileged classes of France and tell them plainly that the ordinary people of the country could no longer pay for the luxury of a system that produced nothing of value for the majority and consumed everything of value at the center. And Louis XVI, caught between a genuinely felt moral instinct toward fairness and a complete inability to act decisively on it, managed only to half reform, to partially concede, to call the Estates General in 1789 in a desperate attempt to find a political solution to a financial crisis that had already passed the point where political solutions were workable. The French Revolution that began in 1789 and accelerated into systematic political violence by 1792 was not, as the Bourbon family would have preferred to believe in retrospect, simply a conspiracy of radicals and foreign agitators who had manipulated an otherwise content French population into rebellion. It was the accumulated consequence of a full century of deliberate choices made by Louis XIV to pursue military glory at the direct cost of fiscal ruin, choices made by Louis XV to ignore the problem rather than confront it, choices made by the aristocracy and the clergy to block every meaningful reform that might have preserved the system by making it survivable for the people at the bottom of it. And in this precise sense, the revolution was not something that happened to the Bourbon dynasty, but something the Bourbon dynasty, through a century of compounding failures of political imagination and moral seriousness, had essentially constructed for itself, brick by careful brick, year by comfortable year, right there inside the gilded walls of the palace at Versailles. The execution of Louis XVI in January 1793, followed by the execution of Marie Antoinette in October of the same year, sent the surviving members of the Bourbon family fleeing across Europe into the courts of Austria, Russia, Prussia, and Britain, where they spent the next 20 years as the most distinguished refugees in the history of Western civilization. The Bourbon pretender, Louis XVI's brother, took the title Louis XVIII in exile and spent those years producing a steady stream of diplomatic correspondence, making promises of constitutional moderation to any power willing to listen, and waiting with the particular patience that dispossession and powerlessness tend to produce in even the most arrogant of families, for Napoleon Bonaparte to make a mistake large enough to allow his Tory to reverse itself. Napoleon's decisive mistake came in Russia in 1812, and by 1814 the combined armies of Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia had fought their way into France, and the Allied powers, confronted with the question of what to do with a country that had spent 25 years overthrowing every government it created, decided that the most stable solution available was to restore the Bourbon monarchy, not because the Bourbons had earned it back through any demonstrated reform of character or policy, not because the French people were particularly enthusiastic about their return, but because a constitutional monarchy under a legitimate dynasty seemed meaningfully less likely to produce another Napoleon than any of the Republican alternatives then on offer. Louis XVIII entered Paris in May 1814 and issued the Constitutional Charter, which promised freedom of the press, equality before the law, and a bicameral legislature with genuine powers. And for a brief, cautiously optimistic moment, it seemed possible that the Bourbons had actually absorbed something important from the catastrophe that had cost them the throne in the first place. The observation attributed to the diplomat Talleyrand, that the Bourbons had learned nothing and forgotten nothing, proved more accurate than Louis XVIII's constitutional charter initially suggested. Because when Louis died in 1824 and his brother Charles X took the throne, the new king proceeded to demonstrate with remarkable speed and thoroughness that he had interpreted the Restoration not as a second chance requiring humility and genuine political accommodation, but as a vindication requiring the rollback of every revolutionary change that had reshaped French society since 1789. Charles issued the July Ordinances in 1830, suspending freedom of the press, dissolving the newly elected legislature before it had even convened for its first session, and dramatically restricting the voting, franchise, and the Parisian working and middle classes, who had been entirely willing to accept a constitutional monarchy but had no interest whatsoever in the return of the pre-revolutionary order, responded within 3 days with a revolution that drove Charles X into exile in Britain and replaced him with Louis Philippe of the Orléans branch of the Bourbon family. The Orléans monarchy lasted until 1848, when another revolution, this one driven by economic depression, mass unemployment, and a reform movement demanding broader voting rights, ended Bourbon rule in France permanently, and Louis Philippe fled to Britain in his turn, and France proceeded through the Second Republic and then the Second Empire of Napoleon III, and then the Third Republic. But the Bourbons had always been an extraordinarily prolific family, with branches established across southern Europe through generations of strategic royal marriages, and the Spanish branch, the Bourbons, had been ruling Spain since 1700 when Louis XIV placed his grandson Philip V on the Spanish throne, a line that survived the Spanish Civil War, survived the long decades of the Franco dictatorship, and de-emerged in 1975 when King Juan Carlos I restored Spanish democracy and placed the Bourbon monarchy at the center of the new constitutional order, a decision that the Spanish parliament endorsed, that the Spanish people ratified, and that political scientists still study as one of the most skillfully managed democratic transitions of the 20th century. Today, in 2025, a direct male line descendant of Henry IV of France, King Felipe VI, sits on the Spanish throne, presides over a constitutional monarchy that is a full member of the European Union and NATO, and represents a Bourbon dynasty that has now survived 2 French revolutions, multiple forced exiles, the Napoleonic Wars, the collapse of the Spanish Empire, a civil war, and a 40-year authoritarian interlude. The Bourbon family that lost its head on a Parisian scaffold in 1793, and that the combined force of revolutionary ideology, military defeat, and popular fury could not permanently remove from European history, is, by any reasonable measure, one of the most durable political dynasties the Western world has ever produced. And the most honest explanation for that durability is not divine right or genetic superiority, but the family's recurring, hard-learned, often catastrophically delayed capacity to find, usually after losing everything, the version of itself that the moment actually required.